we can certainly do that for you. So welcome to another epic special guest series. We've loved doing these. We've had some great visitors come and share things with our community. It has been amazing to have you all. And I hope that you've learned some great things too and been able to really utilize this time best for your own benefit. So tonight we have Amy Van Slambrook. She is a trauma and relationship psychotherapist and coach. She has studied with the foremost experts in trauma, relationships, faith, functional nutrition, and brain health. Through her process of going deep into the messages of core, unhealed traumatic wounds, she identifies what's holding people back to finally allow them to have a long sought after breakthrough and finally heal. I love that. Amy's therapy and coaching clients call her rare, God-given gifts, mysterious, and magical. Raised as a minister's daughter in the Midwest, Amy knew since she was 9 that she had a God-given vision to help people and lots of passion to make it a reality, no matter what it took. Trauma kept her silent about it for nearly 25 years. Childhood sexual abuse, rape, emotional abuse, anorexia, divorce, losing her corporate job, and multiple chronic health issues that nearly took her life. But she never gave up, and soon living in the silence of a small life was unbearable. She went from working in a cubicle to a corporate executive, to losing her job, to building a 6-figure coaching and therapy practice over the last 10 years. For 15 years, Amy was worked to personally heal her own traumas through therapy and coaching while working as a healthcare executive. She also went through world-class education and training to help others do the same. Amy's on a mission to break the silence of trauma for women and couples all over the world and make people stronger because of it. Through online therapy, coaching, masterminds, and groups, she's making that childhood God-given mission a reality, leading thousands of women and couples into the amazing lives they were meant to live. Amy's a sought-after podcast guest, published author, and consultant, and we are thrilled to have you here with us tonight, Amy. Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure you are unmuted here. You might have to do it on, there you go.
I just gave you permission. Thank you so much, Leanne. It really is just my honor to be here with all of you tonight.
So tell us a little bit about your backstory. How did you get to where you are?
Well, as you could kind of tell from my bio, it wasn't a straight line. It certainly wasn't, white picket fence, graduate from high school, go to college, get a nice degree, and end up in this field. I took the windy road and the bumpy road, but that was actually the biggest blessing for me because I've realized that every single one of the traumas that I've been through or still get brought into my life serve a purpose, because those are the very women who end up in the therapy room with me, metaphorically speaking, because my practice is all online now, but it really gives a whole new perspective to it. And so my trauma started really early in my life when I was 5 with abuse outside of my home. And then, as is the case for many people with complex trauma, I had multiple incidents of trauma that happened throughout my lifetime. When I was a teenager, and then a painful divorce very early in my 20s, and obviously a painful marriage before then. And as many people with trauma know, all throughout that journey, chronic health issues become a big factor, whether it's migraines or digestive issues. Lots of perfectionism that, of course, also resulted in anorexia. And then trying to be a high achiever the whole time, having to maintain that perfect picture on the outside. But I always felt this pull, and there was always this vision in my heart that I kind of minimized and tried to squash and tried to pretend like it wasn't there. And then really over the last 10 years, that has just gotten louder and louder within me. And I've really come to the place after I went through intensive healing, both physically, but also through therapy and coaching, to get to the place where I just wasn't willing to wait anymore. And certainly, you know, being 47 helps that too. You get a sense of urgency. I'm sure many of you can relate to that, where we don't want to live silent anymore, and we don't have the same kinds of superficial concerns about just being who we are, and making sure that we resonate with the people we're called to resonate with, but not being concerned to please the masses. So I love what I do. It is just such an incredible blessing, and I get to work with so many amazing, amazing, strong women, to help them reconnect with their own voice, and that often bleeds over into working with them and their husbands or partners, to do a lot of really intense healing. So hopefully that gives a picture into my journey.
It does. Now, I listened to a recording you did with Tim Story, and I loved it. And so one of the things, like when Amy says that she's a perfectionist, you guys need to understand she was like the valedictorian of her high school and a cheerleader and everything else as well. So I would say like the extreme perfectionism. And maybe let's back up a minute here. Is how do you define trauma? Because trauma is kind of a buzzword that is tossed around a lot. And what do you define as trauma?
Well, really, as I've studied the definition, it's really an interruption in someone's life experience to the extent that it causes, this will sound very clinical, significant emotional disruption. For some people, it is the divorce of their parents. That is their major trauma. For other people, that may not be a significant issue. So a lot of it is relative. And almost everybody who I come in contact with says, well, is that really trauma? I mean, it wasn't as bad as, and then they list, starving children in a foreign country, or people who go through daily abuse. But that doesn't make their trauma any less important or significant for them.
Right. And I think that's such a powerful distinction, because a lot of times, people think like, well, it's just what happens to everybody, not that it
Exactly.
can have an interruption in day-to-day life or some sort of effect on the individual. And so there's almost a tendency to minimize it and
Absolutely.
to maybe not get support.
Yes. And that's sort of inherent to people who go through trauma. We suffer in silence. We want to just be able to do it on our own. And the perpetrator often gives us that message, right? That it's something we've done wrong, or we've invited it, or it isn't a big deal, or we're wrong for feeling pain about it. That often is the case with emotionally abusive relationships that are horribly traumatic. But of course, part of that is the blame and shame that comes from the abuser.
Mm-hmm. With that definition of trauma, it seems as if 99.9% of the population is experiencing trauma even right now as we go through this COVID-19 challenge. What do you think is going to come out of that, or how is that going to impact people?
Yeah, I've really been thinking about this a lot, Leanne, and all of you, because it's like the world is having a cultural trauma trigger. And for those of us with trauma in our history, we know what a trauma trigger feels like. Now the rest of the world is experiencing one, and how disruptive it is. And so I think, in the best case, it gives a greater compassion for one another, a greater compassion for our fragility as human beings, and for the things that we held as pressures, because trauma has a way of showing that to us. Suddenly we're aware of the things that made us innocent, because those are cast aside, and we cling to those a little bit more tightly. I think it in the negative, it's going to really affect people's physical health, their bodies. I think the ability to calm ourselves will be something that's a little more elusive, because we had to deal with more than just not being able to go to the nail salon. We actually had to deal with our very life being threatened just by going to the store. And so I think it is a welcome wake-up call in some ways, so that we really start to think about what's most important. But I think things like restorative yoga are going to be even more important, because, as you know, I'm sure, Bessel van der Kolk is one of the leading experts in trauma, and he talks about the enormous value of yoga in healing trauma because it's stored at the body level. He says something is traumatic because it prevents the body from actually being able to do what it wants to do naturally. When we're violated, we want to run, and we're prevented from doing that. And so yoga can work out traumatic healing that we can never work out talking it through, because it literally is stored so deeply that just moving the body is what will release it and help to process it.
We experience that a lot. We get people who very often are surprised. They'll be in a deep hip opener. We always say that emotion is held in the hips.
Yes.
And as we begin to work with that energy in the hips, sometimes people experience this emotional release, and they'll find themselves in tears, and they kind of get up and they're very taken aback, like, why am I crying? It's just a yoga class. And we say, oh, everybody does that. You're fine. Like, this is the norm here as we unlock it. But we really do see that energy is stored at the cellular level in the body.
Yes.
So it's interesting. Now, tell me a little bit about, is there ever a time, and maybe it's, this is a little bit of a devil's advocate question, can trauma be useful?
I believe it can, because I really see that there's a lot of purpose in it. Because it is in the healing of that I really believe so many of us can come into our the best, most loved parts of ourselves, the most powerful parts of ourselves, because it makes us examine what's been holding us back. I think that trauma can help us get a different set of priorities in life. And it can also help us realize the resources that we have within ourselves to really contribute, to love, to really fulfill our purpose here on earth. And I think that for couples, it can be a point of intimacy. First, it becomes a point of divide, because couples, generally speaking, marry somebody who's going to trigger them in exactly the same way they were triggered in childhood. It doesn't mean that they're abusing them, but we bring those wounds that are sort of complementary. And when I studied the research on this and became friends with the therapists who actually found this phenomenon to be true, what's really beautiful is that when we learn what the other person needs to heal, by giving that healing, we actually heal what's inside of us. And so it becomes this beautiful bonding experience that allows a couple to see a part of themselves that they never would have seen without the presence of trauma. My whole mission is that trauma is my greatest treasure, because it's allowed me to fulfill my purpose, to make a difference in the world, and to help people realize their internal strength. But that's all about perspective. Certainly there are many people who see it as nothing but a curse, and something that is victimized them, and it has, but they don't have to be overpowered by it.
So tell me, to go back to, you were talking about how in a couple relationship, how the one can heal the other's trauma. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of that? What would that look like in real form?
So for instance, this couple gives a great example of their relationship. Both grew up in unhealthy, toxic homes. She grew up in a home that was highly physically abusive. And her mother was physically abusive, emotionally abusive, and her father was an alcoholic, and would abandon them for days on end, with this mother who was very cruel. Her husband grew up in a home very different. They were faith-focused people, and had this really glossy exterior, but his dad ended up having multiple extramarital affairs and eventually, left the family and was a real distancer. And so when they got married, early on in their marriage, she was trying to do everything she could to please him and be close to him. And so one day she made scrambled eggs, and it wasn't, he just didn't want that for dinner. They were college students and married, and so they were fighting and fighting and fighting, and he was just tired of it. And he said, "I'm out of here." And he left. And that was a trigger for her, because that's what her dad had always said, "I'm out of here." And so that wound became a real point of tension between the two of them. But he also had an abandonment wound. And so by learning what she needed for him to be present, to stay in the room, or at least to say, I'm not abandoning you, I just need some space. He was also staying present with that little boy inside of him who felt abandoned by his father. Does that make sense? It's a little hard to explain.
No, it does. It does. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what's my husband's wound and what's mine? And looking at it, is there ever a time in a relationship where two people come together and it's not like trauma matching?
Only if one person is willing to go so far with their work. And I've seen that happen. And I believe everybody goes at the speed their healing needs to go at, and whatever their soul is ready for. But it is very unfortunate, because it's sort of a double wound for the other person, that when both people expose that deepest part of themselves, there's a real vulnerability in that you may not have had in your marriage before that point in time. And when one person says, "I just can't go any further," but the other person's ready to go, it's a very painful situation. And that certainly has happened. And I kept working with both people. And the one who is ready to go forward is doing really, really well 2 years after the fact. And the one who wasn't ready to go forward is still not ready to go forward. And, they've chosen to stay where they are.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, okay. So how do you think that looking at, if we look at this current time as a collective trauma, what can people do in this time to mitigate the effects or to manage it?
Right, because I think what's so difficult is that it changes so rapidly, and we have no idea when it's going to end, which is often the way trauma is. If any of us have lived in a traumatic home or a long-term relationship, it's not like we have a nice, neat end date. You'll only be suffering for 2 more months, and then this will all be over. It's the fact that it's a vague finish that also adds to the level of pain that we're experiencing, and that's certainly present here. We don't know when it's going to end. But when I reflected on my journey and times when suffering just didn't seem like it was ever going to end, I realized that there were 3 components that I made sure I incorporated that really helped me get through, beyond just seeing that it would have a purpose, because that was ultimately what got me through. But I say it's about being grounded, surrounded, and connected. And I talked with Tim a little bit about this. Staying grounded in your body, your mind, and your spirit. you know, whether it's a daily routine, whether it's a daily yoga practice, meditation, prayer, exercise, really healthy nutrition, the things that are the fundamentals of our day can stay constant in this time. Staying surrounded by really positive messages. You know, the traumatized brain needs to be healed. We actually see lesions on the brain when there's been trauma, not just blunt force to the head trauma, but emotional trauma causes injury to the brain. And so part of what will heal the brain literally is if we flood it with positive messages, and with people who are going to really speak that truth into our lives. And that leads to being connected. So however you can be connected to the people who are life-giving and not life-draining is going to be essential. Staying connected to them visually, or at least over the phone so that you can hear a voice. Obviously, we can't do a whole lot of touching right now, but making sure that you still stay connected to those people as much as possible is really essential. You know, those are kind of your 3 lifelines right now to get through a crisis and through trauma.
I love that. It's a great, just a great way to think of it. Now, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the work at HeartMath and the heart rate variability, and looking at the seems like the vagal nerve is everywhere I turn around lately. Mm-hmm. Does the vagal nerve have any sort of role in trauma or vagal nerve tone?
I believe it does. Absolutely. I think the evidence is so overwhelming. And that's, again, something that Bessel van der Kolk advocates for strongly, and just has seen amazing results in helping people to tune in to healing their trauma. Again, to paying attention to the fact that it's at the body level that we really need to start our healing. And that will facilitate some of the healing that happens in therapy, in talk therapy. But it's incredible. This sort of touches on things like the language center in the brain gets shut down at the moment of trauma. And so that's why a lot of people can't recount it. Well, that also affects, you know, the vagal nerve. It also affects our digestion. It affects just all kinds of things. And so by attuning to those deeper levels of our essentially our heart's communication, which is what HeartMath is all about. You know, it's the messages that our heart is communicating as we seek to regulate the variability of that. That make it just such a fascinating process. And I think it would be hard for people to really dismiss that as a viable way of bringing healing, in my estimation, and what I've seen in my own work.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, we're finding out so much more, it seems, about how things are interconnected, and almost the biological basis of some psychological processes that we've suspected maybe for years, but never really had the science behind it to back and say, well, here it is, you know, in the physiology that affects the psychology. Talk about in relationships, the trauma, if there's trauma that occurs in relationship, if people are kind of drawn to each other based on this premise of healing their core trauma or whatever, I don't know what the right term is, but their childhood trauma, or, you know, so that's just almost like, it seems like it's like this magnetic pull. Yeah. What happens as they then grow together and more trauma is acquired, I guess is the word.
Right. And that can result in trauma bonding. So rather than bonding over the things that might be a healthier thing to bond over, you know, common passions or beliefs or interests or goals in life, people can bond over the wounds that they've had. And some people become dependent on that, so that if they're in a healed state, they don't know how to bond with this person anymore. You know, what is the allure if it can't be that we're sharing our trauma together? But it can also be an opportunity, you know, that if they're weathering trauma together and that they have weathered trauma separately, it can be an opportunity for real growth and intimacy if they are vulnerable about their experience with it. And we call that wound the core wound, you know, or the primal wound that happened earlier in life. And so I really see it as an opportunity if that happens. And certainly we don't wish that on any couple. But I think in the course of life, day to day, it's the odds are that you will endure some trauma. And Leanne, I know that you and your husband have had your own journey with that. And that that is not an experience that you dream of ever. But it can be something that brings you closer than you could ever imagine.
It has. It was, we actually had multiple traumas. So we had, shortly after we got married, we lost a son at 32 weeks gestation. And it, you know, we grew a lot through that individually and collectively. And then it took us about another year to have our daughter. And it was a very high risk, crazy pregnancy. And, you know, she arrived, of course, with a little bit more trauma with the cord around her neck and them having to cut the cord before she was delivered. And then she came out and everything was fine. And some things that they were concerned about, we decided that she was okay. And then when she was 4 months old, he was diagnosed with an extragonadal germ cell tumor in the mediastinum, which is a kind of really rare cancer. And, you know, I think that the irony of it is anything that we've gone through or that I've gone through in my life, I lost my dad when I was 18, like all kinds of stuff, but have been able to, with the people that walk into my life, to be able to be present and available, and somebody can come in and say something and it typically doesn't faze me.
Yeah.
Because of that. And I think it created a sense of compassion and an ability to not have that, oh, you know, somebody can come in and say whatever. But it's, you know, I think it does have I joke and I say, you know, like, gosh, how is it that we got this load of crap? And, you know, somebody else has like nothing and their big drama is what to cook for dinner or, you know, whatever it might be. We were on a different, you know, trajectory that God or whoever decided like, oh, let's play with these guys. And I wouldn't trade any of it because I think that it really has given us some tools of resiliency and compassion and, you know, is it easy? Absolutely not. But I think that it has been something that helps me work with clients and just anybody. But I know that that's, you know, again, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but I can hold space for anybody with it.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it is. You know, allowed you because you had the courage to heal, Leanne, and to actually apply it and courageously move through it, you are able to have an exponentially more powerful sensitivity to everyone who comes through your studio. And I would imagine a lot more people than that because of that depth that it creates within you. Because like you, I've said, I'd go through every one of the things again that I've been through because of how deeply I'm able to be there in the room, so to speak, with people who need healing and need us to be present there. And I would imagine the same is true for you. You know, my hope is that this next part of your life would be or they're simple with some just minor hiccups, oh my gosh, we've got to repaint the house or something. But certainly, I think that those of us who are given more trauma also have a much bigger calling on our lives often. And that allows us to be the most powerful that we can in those situations. Yeah.
What would you say, Amy, is your core life's message?
Oh, I really believe that it is that we must live beyond the silence of the trauma in our lives, that trauma really is our treasure, if we allow it to be.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see, if you were to live like fully into your ultimate potential, what does that look like?
For me, that will ultimately be speaking in front of stages, thousands of people or millions at some point, but being able to just passionately speak about that burn within my heart, to say to every woman and man, that you have an enormous message inside of you, and that you don't need to live underneath the weight of the silence of the lies that trauma inflicts on you. That it is in fulfilling that and moving beyond that I believe our world is going to be in a much, much better place, but that nobody deserves to live in a hidden, silent place. And so I am starting my first book this year, and really excited about that. And just getting my message out more and more, about not only the depth that trauma affects us, but the heights to which it can take us. Because I think that's really something that I can deeply appreciate, the multifaceted nature of that, but also that a lot of people are feeling that in their own heart and life, and that there really is a path to make that happen.
Right, which I think is so different than, sometimes I think people become wounded by the trauma, and then it's almost like if an animal has a wound and they just keep messing with it and licking it and focusing on it again and again and again, it can never heal. So I love what you talked about, how it can have this higher purpose.
Yes. Yes. And we don't have to run scared. I tell everyone that I work with, I go very, very deep. I'm going to go to the foundation to find whatever crack it is that's preventing people from breaking through. And usually that is a core wound that hasn't been healed. And by going in there and we do some inner child work, there's usually a message that inner child, if you will, or younger self still needs to say, whether they are confused or they are just hurting beyond measure or whatever it is. And it's in reconnecting to that wound and finding out what is it that wound needs? What does that child need to hear? What is that message? And when we start to become aware of that inner child voice, that is what drives these everyday choices, for self-care, for communicating in our relationships, for letting people know our boundaries and our needs. It's amazing. And it sounds a little bit funny and corny to say, well, what does your little Leanne say? But that really resonates with the women who I work with, because then they can attend to themselves like they would their own child, and say, oh, well, I'm needing to not take on so much, or I need to draw boundaries, or I need time alone, or I need to tell them to stop hurting me. So it's a really beautiful process.
Yeah, I worked with a great coach earlier this year, and part of it was coming back to the sense of really looking at that childhood self. And like as a kid, I had these huge ideas. I was a little bit mischievous and would, entrepreneurial. I would have like a carnival in the backyard and take the king size sheets and nail them up in the side yard and create a tent and get all these things that we were going to sell to the neighbors and, bring them all in, have a lemonade stand, and realize we could save money if we had people drink the lemonade in the cups right there at the curb, as opposed to giving them and, then people said like, oh, Leanne and her big ideas, almost shutting it down. Yeah. But when I got beyond that and was able to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I was allowing, my failed popsicle stick house entrepreneurial adventure to affect me at 50. That was like one of those, oh, wow, like moments, and really reclaiming that and no longer allowing comments related to that to shut me down, but also to reconnect with that mischievous part. And like, who cares if they think I'm foolish?
Exactly. I love that. And you can sense that in your spirit. I think what's beautiful is that mischievous, energetic, passionate child is what sparkles in you today, by reconnecting to her, because you have this limitless passion and energy and innocence, even though we know that you've had a lot of life.
Yeah. Well, and I think that when people don't have that, like it's almost when they try to truncate or, push that down, it takes so much more energy. Yeah. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see as people come through this COVID-19, are they trying to go back to a sense of responsibility and business as usual, or hanging on to the trauma, or we go right into a presidential election, so that'll be exciting as well. But how will people reclaim that sense of safety? And I am safe, I am loved, I am cared for in this moment, all is well.
Yeah.
Do you have any tools that you would suggest that people use? I know you talked about your 3-tiered process, but like tangible, tactical things that people could implement?
Right, exactly. I think one of the most important things is to pay attention to your internal dialogue, because often we feel that anxiety rise up, or we feel like we're not feeling safe, or we feel hesitation about going into a situation that used to be normal for us. And we don't quite connect what we're telling ourselves about that. Is it that, well, I could never trust that space again? Or, oh my gosh, when is the next threat going to come out of the blue? I can't rest. I can't trust that relaxed state anymore, because it felt like it, jumped out at you, so to speak. So the inability to really be in a relaxed, joyful state, I would imagine for most people is going to be pretty elusive, because it almost feels like we were deceived by the rest. We thought we could relax, and then all of a sudden this horrible crisis happened. So I would sense more hypervigilance in people. But I think when we pay attention first to our bodies, if you just start to feel anxiety and do a quick body scan and saying, am I feeling tension in any part of my body right now? And when you identify that, just saying, if I had to give that tightness in my chest, if I had to give it words, what would it say? And often it's, well, I can't breathe, or I feel trapped, or I feel something heavy, and that is a way that our internal emotional experience gets expressed externally. And so if you're feeling that heaviness or that tension, or like you're trapped, well, what does it need? Does it need to feel space? Does it need to feel reassured that this isn't all on your shoulders? What is it needing? And just going through that process, very basic, whatever comes to mind first is what works. And then addressing it with even some basic things, reassuring yourself, you know, I know right at this moment in this present space, I'm safe and I am in control of my surroundings. You know, like when I saw all of the food flying off the shelves, I said, this is a major trauma trigger. The food supply hasn't been cut off. Vegetables are still growing. You know, we're still getting all of the food that we need. That hasn't been cut off, but we sure acted like it had, you know, that we'd never again have food. So we've got to stockpile it for the next 6 months. And so I think it's just calming yourself in that moment as well. If you feel yourself kind of getting in that frenetic state, say, wait a minute, there will be more. There's more than enough to fulfill my needs. You know, reassuring yourself just like you would your child. I think that generally speaking, if we tune into that inner nurturer that I believe all of us have, that can be your greatest ally right now, because you're going to need a lot of nurturing as you re-enter life, because it's sort of like a 2-year-old learning to rely on their own 2 legs to provide them with steadiness. You know, we're going to be a little bit wobbly for a while, and it's just staying with yourself in that process and reassuring yourself along the way. You're going to fall, you're going to freak out when you shouldn't, but really attending to all of those senses. And then that inner dialogue is going to be critical for you. And again, I can't overemphasize having those positive messages flow. I do some exercises called brain priming, where you write down some positive mantras, if you will, every single day, you know, that are truths that you declare over yourself. You know, that I am safe and I am well right in this moment. You know, that I am surrounded by abundance and I'm loved, deeply loved. And that you can make choices and you can feel safe in the world, and you get to decide how much you take on during the day. So I hope those are of some help to people.
Those are great. They're great suggestions. Thank you for those. Now let's see if there are some questions from our group. If you have a question, you can either write it in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask it. I know that there may be some specific questions out there, and we want to make sure that this is a great opportunity for you to get any questions you've got asked. So there is, can you talk a little bit more about heart math? And what are some specific things to raise vagal tone?
You know, I don't do a lot of heart math and working with vagal tone in my practice. I do a lot more inner child work. So Leanne, you may be able to speak to that more than I can. That really requires special expertise, and I apologize. My light just went out in front of me, so I look like I'm in mood lighting. But yeah, that isn't an area that I would say. I can certainly, you know, send out some more information about that, and I would be happy to connect you guys with some wonderful articles and things on that.
Yeah, I've done one of the heart math trainings, and then I just got back at the beginning of March from a yoga and science conference, and a lot of it's looking at vagal nerve tone right before, you know, the whole shutdown occurred. Let's see, we have more questions, so we'll pause those because I can answer those later. When will your book be available?
Well, that, again, because of this crisis and how I had to pivot my own practice and business, I was hoping that that would be out later this year, but it'll likely be next year when that comes out, because I've really completely devoted myself to helping people through this crisis and being on as many interviews as I can, and doing a lot more help in my private practice, and a group coaching program that's going to be coming out in May. So hopefully in 2021. barring any other major global pandemics.
Yeah, it's my cousin wrote a book about a couple years ago, and she had said she was going to write a book, and I was out visiting in LA, and we were shopping at the Garment Mart for some things for the studio. And I said, Kathy, when are you going to write your book? And she's like, oh, I haven't started. I just have the cover. And I was like,
Oh.
write the book. And it was done within a couple months. So you never know.
That's true.
We'll just hold that possibility for you there too.
That's right. That's right. I know that with, in my life, my faith is a huge influence. And so when that is behind it, I don't put any barriers around what can happen. So I'm excited about it. And I have actually started writing it. So we're further along than the cover in the process. So
that's awesome. What does it have a title yet, or a working title?
It is. I'm in the process of trademarking it. And so I will share that when that is all completed and finalized, but definitely has to do with my message of trauma to treasure, because that really has been on my heart for decades. So yes.
Wow. You'll have to keep us posted.
I will. Thank you for being excited with me about that.
Oh yeah. Now, okay. This is what happens when you turn 50. Like, these questions, they seem very small on my computer.
I'm convinced that it's the resolution of the screen and not our eyes. It's something.
I would think that, but the last 2 years, it seems to have gone downhill. Okay, so here's another question. Can one do inner child work without a therapist?
I caution people to do that. It's one thing that if you've done the initial work with a therapist, I think then it can be done. But if you haven't really done that work in the state of someone who has, whether a trauma coach or a trauma therapist, you can unearth some wounds that can be really overwhelming. And so one of the things that I know about me as an Enneagram 8 with a 2 wing is that I am extraordinarily protective of the people who I work with. And that extends to, any of you in the room, that I would never want you to get in a position where you are trying to do inner child work and you encountered a wound that you didn't realize was there, or you didn't realize how intense it was, because it can be emotionally and psychologically just overwhelming. I definitely think it can be done frequently if you've had someone help you through that and guide you through it and be present in the room the first time you've done it, for sure. Yeah, and it's powerful beyond measure.
So maybe the question, like a follow-up question, would be, how long does it take for someone to do some inner child work? Because perhaps, I don't know what's behind that question, but maybe it was, I don't want to be in a therapist relationship for 6 years.
No, and it really depends on the person, but my whole focus, and I tell every one of my clients this, I'm out to work myself out of a job. I want to give you such inner strength and confidence in your own ability, and so many tools that you don't feel like you have to be in therapy for the rest of your life. Certainly, I've had clients that I've stayed with for 6 years, but we've evolved our work. We're not still working on the same things. And I don't want people to suffer in that for that amount of time. Nobody does. And so definitely the clients who are really familiar with their inner child, when I talk to them years after, if I ever have the blessing of doing that, they're still doing their inner child work, because we have sort of perfected their own method for doing that, and they feel very safe with it. And that's why I talk about it frequently with people. So yeah, I'm not an advocate of like, stay with your therapist for 50 years. That just isn't a healthy model in my mind. So.
And what I will say too is the importance of a good therapist. So you were mentioning that you do work online. So
yes,
it's important that you find somebody who you trust and who's not crazy. I had a fabulous therapist years ago in California in Del Mar, and then moved and saw someone here. And I searched and hunted her down like 20 years later. And I was like, Enid, oh my gosh, I've just encountered the craziest thing. Like, you've got to give me somebody's number in Tennessee. So now I love that there's all these other modalities, but
Yes.
if you've ever gone to a therapist and maybe not had the greatest experience, find a different one.
Yes.
Yes. And you've got a great one right here in front of you.
Well, thank you. I feel blessed. And that is I echo that, because one of the things we usually tell ourselves is, well, it must be me. I'm not doing something, so they're not, their work isn't working, or their method isn't working, or they don't like me because something. No, just trust yourself. And if you're not feeling comfortable, the most important thing is that you feel comfortable and safe. So
it's just like dating or getting married. Like, you have to find the right match.
Yes.
You're going to have deep, intimate conversations. Like, you can't really just find the first one out of the yellow pages.
No.
Like, being set up with a therapist is always a good thing, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So here is another question. What do you suggest for language couples, partners, friends can use during this time when they see that the other person is triggered in the moment experiencing trauma? So if a past trauma is triggered, it sounds like that question is, or is it the current trauma of the event?
That was my question. Yes. So for me, I have noticed that I've been triggered during quarantine. Certain things have happened and that's triggered me automatically. And for myself, because of doing inner work, I've learned, inner child work, I've learned, okay, to communicate to the other person, hey, I'm triggered. I'm not going to be able to hear anything that you say right now because of this. I need some space. So I've learned how to communicate, but also just for good experience for someone to learn what can they do for the other person when they see the other person is triggered in the moment, or another trauma has a past trauma has kind of come up because of, current situation. It's almost like it's like a past wound is opened up or something like that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm sorry to hear that you've been triggered. I know that it's been happening for so many people, and we don't expect it, because it's not like this is exactly like a situation we went through 20 years ago. This is something totally different, but there are tenets of it that feels so similar. So, I think one of the first things you can ask is, honey, I noticed that you may be triggered right now. What do you need most from me? And if somebody has done enough work, they're able to answer that. Like your answer was, I need space to process, to do whatever you need to do to help yourself get through that. And there's another sort of script almost that I teach couples. And this is after we've identified this in session. But if you and your husband have had those conversations where he understands, what have you felt this way before? When did you feel this way before? What does it remind you of? And then if you're able to recall that, then you can say, what were you feeling in that moment? What did you need? And how can we get that for you now? Even if it's not obviously in the same way, it may be, just that reassurance that you're not alone, or the reassurance that everything will be okay, whatever that need is, and however it is meaningful for you. For some people, that's, I just need you to hold me. I just need you to hold me right now. For other people, that may be, I just need some space right now to work these feelings out. So those are some tools that couples really seem to be able to remember in the moment, because I think that's the other challenge, Valerie, that you know, oftentimes when we're triggered, we don't have the best memories or, you know, or nice, neat scripts. So if you don't, simply saying, what do you need most from me right now? And then there's no judgment about it. Like, that's, you know, why would you need that? Just absolutely doing it with that unconditional love and acceptance. Does that help? Yeah.
All right. So someone else asked, if you had one tip for couples to work on better communication together, what would that be?
You know, I think this situation is just the perfect storm for things to get magnified in couples, because you are in a concentrated situation under an enormous amount of stress. It's not like you are in Fiji in a nice hut over the ocean. You are in quarantine with an unknown opponent outside your door. And so this tends to magnify that. I think what I really advocate is having daily check-ins at the beginning and end of the day. I sort of say, just bookend your day. Make sure that you're checking in and really reminding each other that you are on the same team. Because oftentimes our partners or spouses are the ones that we release our tension onto, and then we feel like we're more opponents than partners. And so reminding your partner, hey, we're a team in this. I'm your ally. I am your biggest fan, and I'm your biggest proponent. And so then you can approach the stress as sort of the enemy of your household. We're not going to let this tear our marriage down. We're not going to let this tear our relationship down. When you develop that allegiance with one another and saying, you know, we need to be checking in. What do you need most from me today? Or what's coming up for you today? Or just simply saying, you know, how are you? How are you? And adding that into your day. It doesn't have to be like a 30-minute belabored, let's talk about all of the feelings that you're having, because that is torture for a lot of people. Just having a nice check-in, even less than 10 minutes, can really, really start to alleviate some of those conflicts.
Awesome. And then we've got one more here. What are some ways that we can support others, such as children, spouses, friends, who may be experiencing trauma right now during this pandemic? So similar to another, but any other thoughts you have on that one?
Right, exactly. You know, I think in addition to the things that I've been suggesting, you know, really having some bonding moments, adding in some normalcy, especially for children, is important. And that routine, I guess it's not that there's a whole lot that's normal right now, but you can add some consistency and some structure. That's incredibly reassuring for families right now. And I always like to incorporate adding some humor if you can, because that really helps us not only release some stress and increase our T cells, but I think it's also just about gaining some perspective, you know, that this is going to end. This isn't, you know, our ultimate demise. It's going to have an end, and we can find some ways to be silly together. And to really establish, there's a bonding that happens, I think, when we can just laugh together, recall some positive memories together. Expressing gratitude, I think, can really shift our focus. If we're getting irritated with our children, you know, what if you notice 5 things about them that you just love and are grateful for, and you pointed those out to them? That tends to shift not only their experience with us, but our experience with them too. And I always encourage spouses to do that. Be on the lookout more for the positive things than the negative things in your partner.
Really good. And we also know that that gratitude increases heart rate variability.
Yes.
So there's
Yes.
our little heart math tie-in.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much, Amy. This has been great. You gave some great tips, and so great to get to connect with you. And I'm grateful that you came to our community to share. Um, how can people keep in touch with you?
Sure. Well, it has been an honor, and I really, any more questions, however I can be of help, please do reach out to me. I'm going to be having a group coaching program for women in May, but I also have blogs that come out weekly and things like that. So I'm on Instagram. That's sort of my latest social media presence. I'm also on Facebook, or you can find me on my website, which is my very long but actually simply spelled last name, amyvanslambrook.com. And I think you'll have all of that contact information, Leanne, but please do feel free to reach out. I also do email journal sessions, which can be incredibly therapeutic, and it is an easier point of entry to doing some processing of things right now. So I am here, and I just feel blessed to connect with all of you tonight and to get to meet you, Leanne. This was just wonderful.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you. You guys too.
Thank
Thanks.
you.